want to be sensitive of the hour and the time. We're going to go ahead and get started with our conversation on tonight. So tonight, Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, in partnership with the State Convention of Virginia's NAACP, we are sponsoring and hosting this conversation about Souls to the Polls and a more expansive conversation about the importance of early voting. I mean, here we are now right here about 2 weeks out of Election Day, and early voting has been starting in the Commonwealth for the past couple of weeks, and the numbers could be better. And so this is an important conversation for us to have, as we're also in the backdrop of Virginia being a part of national news. Several lawsuits being filed against the governor of the Commonwealth because of some purging of the voting rolls right now. And so it's important that we highlight not just the importance of early voting, but the importance of making sure that your name is on the voting roll. And so not risking waiting until election day to find out that something is wrong. This is another perfect opportunity to go and vote early. So in case a challenge does come up, you have time to address it. So I'm excited to be joined in this space by several of my colleagues from Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. I am Reverend Dr. Lakeisha Cook, one of the co-executive directors of Virginia Interfaith. I am joined by one of my wonderful colleagues who heads up our civic engagement work, Robert Lester. And so we're excited to have him on the call. And also in the background, I just want to acknowledge on the technical side, we have Hamna Salim, who is Director of Communications for Virginia Interfaith, here with us tonight. But our panelists that have joined us on this evening, I'm going to do a brief introduction of the three of them, and then they will introduce themselves as we get started in this conversation. We are excited to have Reverend Cozy Bailey, who is the president of our state convention of NAACP, the state conference. And so very excited to have him with us tonight. Also excited to have Reverend Dr. Linwood Blizzard. He has several important roles that he plays. The one that's closest to my heart is he is part of the board of Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, but he is also a senior pastor, Macedonia Baptist Church. And my sister, Reverend Sierra Smith Bond, who is the senior pastor of Faith Community Church that's right around the corner from where I live in Richmond. And so as we're starting the conversation, because I have spoke place into the space, I think it's important for everyone to know where you all are in the Commonwealth, because we're all in different places in Virginia, and we do bring in the different perspectives of the places where we are. So we want to start this conversation. I'm going to start the conversation with Reverend Bailey. Reverend Bailey, we're talking about the importance of early voting. And so the first question I have for you is, what is the historical role that the Black church played in the civil rights movement, and specifically with voter registration efforts? So talking about the history of Souls to the Polls a little bit.
Sure. And I'm coming to you from Prince William County, Virginia, up here in Northern Virginia. We are known by some as a majority minority community here. I can't stand that term, because if you're in the majority, you're no longer the minority. So Prince William County is a county where most of the people here are people of color. The second largest county in the Commonwealth of Virginia, about the same size as Virginia Beach City. So it is good to be with you all this evening. Let's jump right into it. You know, the history and the origins of Souls to the Polls. I think it's important for us to note that even in this time that we are in right now of early voting, Souls to the Polls originated as an effort of Black churches beginning right after the Civil War during Reconstruction, where Black churches, Black clergy were very much involved in getting all those newly emancipated former slaves involved in the process of government in these United States. And then as we moved through Reconstruction and began what I call the beginning of the civil rights movement, because trust me, today we are still in the midst of the civil rights movement. When Dr. King led that successful bus boycott in 1955, in 1957, churches and civil rights organizations got together to sponsor what they call the Prayer Pilgrimage of Freedom in Washington, D.C. And that was really the beginning of organized African-American clergy and churches working with other civic organizations to get all of those people to the polls. In the early 1990s is when we really began to consummate what we now call Souls to the Polls, because when people hear Souls to the Polls now, they think about early voting on those Sundays. And in the early 1990s is when throughout the country, we began to expand voting opportunities through early voting. And now we have what we have today, Souls to the Polls. So that's a quick run through of the history of Souls to the Polls. By the way, Prince William County just completed its second Sunday voting yesterday. And that's when I voted. I waited until that time because we knew that we were going to be joined with that history-making fraternity brother of Dr. Blizzard, Mr. Don Scott, the first African-American Speaker of the House in the 405-year history of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Black folks are on the move. We're voting early. We are engaged. Again, it's good to be here with you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Bailey. I appreciate you giving the context and the foundation for the conversation that we're building on tonight. Dr. Blizzard, I'm going to ask you to bring your voice in as we're looking at, again, that historical foundation of Souls to the Polls, just expanding on that a little bit more and really talking about like the current connection of Souls to the Polls and the voter turnout in communities of color. And so how is it instrumental even still today in getting the communities of color to turn out to the polls early?
Thank you, Dr. Cook. I greet everybody who joins us this evening. Dr. Linwood Blizzard, as she stated, I've served the senior pastor of the Master Baptist Church in Northumberland County, Virginia, which is a very conservative part of Virginia on the northern neck. Some people call it God's country. I also served the Baptist General Convention of Virginia as the coordinator of social justice and health equity for the Commonwealth. So this issue, we think about the present state, you gotta I thank Reverend Bailey for framing this conversation on the history of Souls to the Polls. We're watching the shift in Souls to the Polls because the biggest issue is disenfranchisement. The aim since we got the right to vote has been to remove the right to vote, not to people of color, but for all people who are not essentially what we think of as landowners in this country. The foundation of voting was built on white men who were landowners, and anybody who was not that had to find their way to Congress to get a chance to vote, including women and people of non-Anglo descent. The current state of the idea of the connecting souls of polls and voter turnout is we're watching voting being taken away from many communities. So we have to give people new strategies, understanding their right to vote. Voting is considered a privilege for some and a right to others. And it should be a right for everybody in this country. And what Souls to the Polls does, it mobilizes congregations, particularly the faith-based community, to be engaged with it, particularly like Prince William County do Sunday voting heavily. But it's really designed to mobilize voter turnout. We know when voter turnout is on a non-presidential year is low. We have it around 20 to 40%. Primaries can be as low as 5 to 10%. Presidential elections, you can see upwards of 60, 70, 80% sometimes of voter turnout. But it's designed to mobilize people to do it. And what it does is that it literally, even in its framing, it's not designed to think of your feet going to the actual polls, but it's spelled intentionally to be that you take your whole being to the poll with you. For us to understand that we vote as a whole person, and how we engage that vote requires us to bring a whole person. So what it's done is really designed to mobilize congregations, give congregations language and conversation spaces to be able to talk to their congregants as well as their communities of how not only the importance of voting, but also inform them on why they should exercise their right to vote.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Blizzard. Reverend Smith Bond, as a senior pastor, again, I already acknowledge you right around the corner from where I live. So I'm already calling your place into the space today. And we're talking about early voting and really talking about how it impacts accessibility. We know Election Day is on a Tuesday, a work day for many people. And so when we're talking about early voting and how it impacts accessibility, can you speak to a little bit about how that specifically impacts marginalized communities?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. So I do pastor a church that's in the east end of the city of Richmond. We're called to serve Fairfield, Wickham, and Creighton courts. So in those communities is God's heart. That is the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed. So when we talk about early voting and just how it impacts, it significantly improves the voter accessibility. When we think about these marginalized communities, as you have mentioned before, some of the barriers on election day is that most of the people that within these communities that we're served, they work long hours. They're essential workers. They don't have the privilege of the conventional 9 to 5. Also, we have the transportation challenges where, you have a older population that may not have transportation to get to the polls. You have caregiver responsibility. So when we're talking about the essential workers, we're also talking about those families that have to pick their kids up, or, schools are closed on election day. So you have to navigate the caregiving and trying to do that. So when we think about early voting and the push for early voting is that it actually extends and it allows more flexibility and just us really exercising our right to vote and being a part of this global using our voice to impact change. It reduces the pressure within those marginalized communities that sometimes come up in regards to the time limits and the time frames. And then it can also increase the turnout just around a group of individuals who have historically have lower participation due to systemic obstacles. So when we acknowledge those systemic obstacles in the marginalized communities, the earlier voting kind of improves that and break down those barriers for them.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that perspective into the space. Again, with the election day being on a work day during work hours for a lot of people, it definitely impacts turnout. And with the lines that could possibly be there with this being a presidential year, that's a longer time, it's going to actually take you to get into actually putting your vote in. So that accessibility is just such a key point to lift up. Reverend Bailey, as we continue to build the conversation, let's talk a little bit more about how do we mitigate some of the things and the obstacles that come up. So in what ways do early voting help to mitigate issues like, and I said it, long lines and last minute voter suppression? How does this help mitigate those things?
Well, I'm gonna start talking without hitting that button. Um, so, so, uh, so Reverend Bond has already talked about, a lot of things about that are mitigated from a standpoint of the long lines and the pressures that are put on underrepresented and communities. Again, I like the part that she brought out about, these are essential workers, which that means is that they have to go to work. For whatever reason, this country has never decided to make presidential voting day or any voting day a national holiday. So everybody has to go to work. And even though those hours of voting may stretch from 10 to 12 hours, they are during the core work hours. And so people have to make decisions on whether they're going to go early in the morning, getting up earlier than they normally do, or rushing after work. In Northern Virginia, let me tell you, rushing somewhere after work just doesn't work very well. We have conditioned ourselves to be used to an hour-long commute from work to home as being a short commute. And so when we have these early voting opportunities there, and in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we worked very hard to expand and expand and expand in order for those opportunities to increase. We have to take advantage of them. Sunday voting is not something that is common throughout the nation. Again, the Commonwealth of Virginia is one of those states that has worked hard to get Sunday voting. And what that does is it helps us to participate in the traditions of Souls to the Polls that Dr. Blizzard explained very well. Also, it does in fact help to mitigate against the variety of voter suppression efforts. Dr. Cook, in your opening remarks, you talked about how we are in the midst of what this current administration calls following the law, but for the people in the communities that the NAACP represents, it is in fact voter suppression. These efforts to cleanse the voter rolls always results in some people who should be on the roll being removed from the roll and then having to claw and fight their way back. And so when we have a very long in the Commonwealth of Virginia early voting period, we mitigate those kinds of things. And they don't all come at the last minute. We see them happening, beginning years ago. And we all know that that's a direct result of a trend that began in 2013 when that Supreme Court decided that the Voter Rights Act of 1965 was no longer applicable, especially sections 4B and 5. And so now those states, Virginia was one of those, that had a record of voter suppression, no longer have to get pre-clearance before they install this new system, these new tactics and strategies, as Dr. Blizzard said, for voter suppression. We must always be very clear-eyed that those who are in power will do whatever they can do to stay in power. And part of that strategy is to suppress the votes of those that they feel will not suppress them. And so the greatest strategy that we have against that, not only the long lines that cause fatigue, but the actual activities that are meant to keep us from voting, is to take advantage of all of these early voting opportunities that we have. And in my case, traditionally, souls to the polls.
Thank you so much for that, Reverend Bailey. Again, with the intent of suppressing votes and the purging of voting rolls, us doing our due diligence is just so very important. And I will speak into the space, and I've told Robert this. I can honestly say in the past, I didn't always check my voter registration. I would literally just make an assumption that all was well, and I would go check in when it was time to vote. But I was sitting a couple of weeks ago at an event, and I heard one of our delegates talk about how a family member was impacted by this latest purge, that her family member whose father, so her grandfather passed away, same name as her dad, just a junior and a senior, checked her dad's voting registration and found out he had gotten purged. And that was a wake-up call for me. I was like, okay, hold on. We need to do our due diligence. And what happens is if people don't check and they wait until election day, they can get there and be in for a very rude awakening and find out that something indeed may have happened. Yeah, so
Absolutely. And Dr. Cook, let me, and that, as many of us know, is the basis for the current lawsuit against the governor for what he's doing. He's
yes.
doing it inside a very short period of time, and then makes so difficult to react to a mistake of removing someone from the rolls. And again, that's even more impetus for us to utilize the opportunities for early voting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for adding that, Reverend Bailey. Okay, so Reverend Blizzard, continue to pull the thread of this conversation. So we're talking about early voting and the access that we have to early voting, specifically in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I will say the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have a long early voting period in comparison to other states. Robert and I were in Florida watching them do a Souls to the Polls back in the summer, and there were several states that were present. And when we told them how long our early voting period was, they were shocked. Right. Because most places don't have very long. And so because of the work of our Virginia legislature, specifically our Black Caucus, we have been able to expand those days a bit. So can you talk a little bit about how early voting has impacted the landscape of the electoral participation?
Yeah, I do want to step back though and talk about this Tuesday situation.
Yes.
It's a weird day, a Tuesday. Like who? I mean, I make my groceries on a Tuesday, the doctors, but why do I have to vote on a Tuesday? And it's the origin of the Tuesday voting. As I live in the rural community, it was built on an agrarian culture in the 19th century. It was built on the idea that Sunday you'd be at church and that you need time after church to get to the vote, which would be about Monday travel and Tuesday to vote and then get back to where you were, which again goes back to white male landowners, which was really built on. When we expanded early, we expand the ability just to vote to other people from other communities. It expands the electoral process. And then when you expand the voting side, it changes. Now, people in Virginia must not forget that this early access without having to justify that you're not going to be in town on November, whatever the year is on that day, is only a few years old. The legislature just voted that in. I believe it was 2020 when it came into law, where we had early voting for this 45-day period. Before that, you had to answer 15 or 20 questions and justify why you could not vote on this day, and so on and so forth, and absentee ballots. Again, the aim of the law is designed to limit voting. By expanding voting, you expand the voice of who comes to the table. It's very much how we see our job in our workspaces. You want to make sure your voice is heard at the table. I've always heard the statement, you're either at the table or on the menu. And part of the challenge for us is that many of us find ourselves on the menu when we should be at the table. This early voting process and timing gives more participation. It allows people to have access. As Reverend Smith-Bond has noted, the essential workers who don't work that schedule to fit this specific 12 to 13-hour window you have to vote on one day in the whole year outside of the primary process, gives more people the ability to come to the table and actually have a voice. The aim of voting is to have a voice, is to engage. As I tell people who say they're not going to vote, I always ask, do you pay taxes? And they say, yeah, because if you don't pay taxes, let me know how you're doing that legally, because that's called usually tax evasion. But if you're paying taxes, you would like to know how your money is spent on the local, state, and federal levels, and your vote is part of that conversation. People miss that fact, and they think their vote doesn't matter, and that's how most of America sees it. And that's where we get these pictures and ideas of that the minority runs the majority. But when you expand voting, expand access to, expand the timing, expand how you can come to it. And the best part of it is you don't even have to register. You can register on election day, provisional ballot, of course, which is thanks to the legislature for that law. It gives you more access all the way to the last minute. If you decide you want to think at the last minute you want to vote. So expanding the access, and I've heard this conversation and recently and how historically how it's been framed, and the idea of limiting the vote is designed to limit the people who have power so that those in power have more power. We have to get to the polls to exercise our voice as the majority of America.
Thank you so much for that, Reverend Blizzard. Reverend Smith-Bond, as a graduate of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University, we know the power of the prophetic voice. And so as we're thinking about the role of the church, but specifically the role of the pastor preacher in this time of civic engagement leading up particularly into the election, this presidential year, can you talk a little bit about the significance of the sermonic moments, sermons, and church events in mobilizing voters during this time?
Yes, and I'm glad that Dr. Blizzard had mentioned this whole notion of our vote being our voice, because as people that are called to proclaim the gospel, it is not the time for us to be silent. The platform that God allows us to grace every Sunday, or even during Bible study, or whenever you stand to speak to the people, is an opportunity for you to equip individuals with knowledge, truth, and to make sure that they're well informed. And a lot of what we're hearing right now in society today, especially with my generation feeling as though they don't need to vote, is embedded in the lack of knowledge. And that's where the church needs to understand that there is a huge opportunity for us to maximize, even in these short amount of days, to make sure that we are preaching and teaching the gospel. And we know that the gospel is a liberating God. We know that part of the gospel is to preach and teach liberation, meaning that you have to speak to these oppression, systemic systems. You have to speak to even the things that we're called to do in whatever faith organization that you're a part of. There is an obligation towards this, right? So with Black, especially African American communities and those marginalized communities, as far as faith leaders, we can just use that platform to emphasize the moral and the civic responsibility of voting. And individuals have to understand this, right? Sometimes we just take it as like something that we do every election, which is why we don't see the turnout that we need to see even on the off elections of presidential. But people need to understand that if we really look at it in a faith lens, that we have a more and a civic obligation to vote. And we can do this by incorporating messages of social justice and empowerment. I believe that we can energize our congregations by engaging in the political process. Every Sunday morning, our church is putting something out about voting, equipping the individuals about voting. Even if it's just counting down, you have this amount of days towards early voting, towards election, right? So we have that obligation, we have that platform that we can energize. Every event that we have, we partner with individuals for voter registration. We want to make sure that you can't say that you stepped foot on our grounds and did not have an opportunity to, one, check your voter registration, to register to vote, and to ask questions to make sure that you are equipped to do. The church has always been a central ground for knowledge, for healing, for love. And we just got to get back to it and understand that we have the power to truly energize, equip, and to move our communities forward, even in this election and beyond. And we just simply just stand up and do what we were called to do. And that is preach the gospel and make sure that we're preaching justice. And you can't preach justice without mentioning your moral and civic obligation to vote.
Thank you so much for that. A quick follow-up, because you brought something up, and I want to kind of pose this for all three of you, speaking to the intergenerational challenge that sometimes comes up when we're talking about civic engagement, particularly some apathy that comes up in certain generations, particularly the younger ones who, you just kind of hear it surfacing like, yeah, I'm not going to vote. My vote doesn't make a difference. Nope, I'm not even liking the choices we have. How do we, as the church, speak to that?
So I'll start off. This is where the knowledge comes from, where you have to literally break it. Where they say all the time, like, meet a person where they are, right?
Yeah.
So for that generation, you have to break it down that they understand that them not exercising their right to vote, how it would impact them, right? So for us, I know in the conversations that I have, even within the church and even in the community, as I'm speaking to individuals, I have to break it down and let them know, like, look, I pull out some of the proposed planning if this election goes a different way. And I break it down to say, this is the impact that you will feel even on this level. Right. So you may be thinking, okay, well, I'm like 18, 19, still in college. I don't have any impact. No, let's break it down. And then also getting the generations to understand that the decisions that we make now has an impact for generations to come, just like our ancestors. The decisions that they made, the reason that they made certain decisions is why we can go out and do early voting or even show up to polls now, right? It's because of their actions and decisions. So when I'm speaking to them, I'm also letting them know you can't just get focused on the now in regards to, okay, well, this is not going to impact me. No, this is going to impact you. And let me show you how it will impact you and break it all the way down to like a micro level that they're able to see, okay, now this makes sense, right? And now they're able to make a well-informed decision because you're able to pull something out that pulls at their heart. So I just really try to meet them where they are so they can really see themselves in this moment.
Thank you for that. Dr. Blizzard, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is in reflecting on the question that's posed, as Reverend Smith-Bond has pointed to, how you engage in meeting them where they are. Part of where people are today is they're isolated. When we reflect on the history of the Black church, and particularly in this conversation, the Black church was communal, and the historicity of which we can on the 1960s backwards. We moved to individualist society where everybody is asking the question, what's in it for me? And there's no we in that statement. And that becomes the challenge on the voting side. And that's how we begin to fragment what we think of as traditionally as a collective to be more of a bunch of individuals coming together to trying to find their way through digital platforms today, basically. They have to see the collective impact. Part of what Reverend Smith-Bond is pointing to is not just showing them what's happening, but the collective impact and the realization that your vote impacts others at the same time. One thing I like to go back to, remember with VICPP and BGC did a joint program on health equity. We talked about vaccinations, and we talked about the thing we had was vaccinate for others. The idea that what I do goes beyond me. That, I think, is the struggle of the contemporary space we're dealing with, is the idea that my actions impact the world that surrounds me, not just what happens to me, just as my neighbor's vote impacts my life. So when we think about the idea of voting, they have to see the larger picture. And that's exactly what Reverend Smith was pointing to. You have to paint the picture for the people to see how this works. People think, indeed, one vote, well, we've seen in Virginia how one vote can change the entire government structure. We've seen it with the what was it, the coin flip in Virginia for the General Assembly's power grab. Like, that one vote matters, but every single vote matters. We've seen it. We saw it in the past presidential elections. Your vote matters all the way down to the individual person. And I think our sense of worth is only defined by what people say that we have as value. But your value is in your voice. Your value is in your vote, and that value is exercised on election day. I think we have to get back to showing people the collective, the bigger picture. Monster, you got to paint the picture for people where they are to see the collective side. And when they see that collective, it changes their whole perspective. And I've seen it from many people.
You know, just adding just a little bit more to that, both to what Reverend Smith Bond said and Dr. Blizzard said, what I found in working with our youth and college division within the NAACP is, yes, we absolutely have to meet folks that young, especially, exactly where they are, because they do things a lot differently than I do. I'm old enough to be most of their grandfather. And at the same time, how you get them to understand the collective is when you tap into it, I found that there are probably less intergenerational differences than we think we see on the surface, because everybody wants to be a part of something that's greater than they are. And that's how, after you meet them at, where they are, and they get to understand the concept of collective, what they do affects other people, it really touches, into their inner being, their desire to help to build something greater than they are. And so, what we might perceive to be a malaise of voting and interaction, especially in governmental affairs, once we connect with folks who are sitting back in their individual silos, who seem to want to be just left alone, who have distrust of the government for personal or historical reasons, as we motivate them the way we are motivated, again, to create something that's bigger and better than we are, then we begin to achieve some successes in getting them to actually integrate.
Thank you so much for that, Reverend Bailey. Go ahead and keep yourself unmuted, because I have a question that we kind of just segued right into it, talking about the power of the collective and that communal power when we have partnerships and people coming together to really impact and affect change. And so can you talk to us a little bit about some notable partnerships or coalitions that are formed around Souls to the Polls and early voting period? I know you talked about what was happening in Prince William.
Sure.
I know down in the Hampton Roads area, NAACP has done a Souls to the Poll there. So can you just talk a little bit about what's going on in the Commonwealth?
Sure. I am not a historian by trade. Okay. I'm actually, but before I entered into this life, I was actually a mathematician, believe it or not. But I think it's important for us to understand some historical context to how we got to where we are today. There was an organization called or a project initiative called the Voter Education Project that was formed in 1962. And it was to coordinate the activities of what we call the Big Five civil rights organizations at that time: the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that we like to say SNCC, the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the National Urban League. It was a official, formalized way of coming together in 1962. So we think about that time frame, to coordinate the activities of all of those different civil rights organizations. And I believe, looking at it, it was an attempt also to, be cross generations, because those different organizations attracted people of different age groups to attack, again, the voter suppression activities that were very prevalent then, in order to educate and then mobilize people to vote. It sponsored voter registration and mobilization, as well as some research to get some data on the voting activities of African Americans. At that time, it operated as a not-for-profit organization. Following that, it lasted for about 30 years. 1992, it faded out. Some different things happened in 1992. Earlier, I talked about the early 90s was the initiation of early voting opportunities. And so it appeared that that challenge was solved. But Black churches have worked alongside Black fraternities and sororities and civil rights organizations and labor unions and Masonic lodges and the VICPP within the Commonwealth of Virginia to create these alliances and allegiances, if you will, to do the big three of what I call voter education, registration, education, and mobilization. I think one of the best examples within the Commonwealth of Virginia is the NAACP's partnership with VICPP. That's where I met my friend, brother Robert Lester, as he came up and reached out to the things that we were doing. And there are strengths of each one of the organizations that, we use the term, a more holistic approach. The NAACP is rock solid on social justice. VICPP does some of the same things, and some of the other organizations also. But our Greek organizations have other strengths, and they attract a different kind of person. And again, there's overlap there. And so we have never been able to survive and move forward operating in silos. And so these partnerships, or these coalitions, I should say, have been formed, and they have helped to create a better environment for people of color, specifically Black people, as we move forward to engage in the political process. But even that's not enough. We talk about registration, education, and mobilization, but these partnerships also help to educate people to understand that that is the beginning of the engagement process with our local, state, and federal government. We must go further and help the people to understand that the way that you really initiate change is after you get the right people in there, is to help them by understanding the boards and commissions that each one of us has a different expertise at the local and state level to be on. And I try to model that. People ask me, where do you get your energy from? I think we all know I get my energy from God. That's why locally, as I work on the jail board here in Prince William County. I serve on the African American Advisory Board at the state level. And I work on the Judicial Inquiry Review Commission to make sure that judges are doing the right thing. And I use that as an example of this is what we have to do. We have to be part of the process. I think, Dr. Blizzard said, if you not at the table, you might be on the menu. That's what I said. This is how you get that chair at the table so that you are not on the menu. And those coalitions and partnerships help us to strengthen that, because they can help educate and ensure that as many people as possible recognize that their obligation doesn't end after they leave the voting booth. That's just the beginning.
Thank you so much for that, Reverend Bailey. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions, and then we're going to wrap up this wonderful conversation. Again, just sensitive to the fact that it is Monday and you all served yesterday. And so just grateful for you even taking the time to hold space to have this conversation. Reverend Blizzard, as we're talking about, again, the church's very pivotal role when it comes to civic engagement. But particularly bringing it into contemporary times in this digital age that we're living in. We have technology that we can leverage as we continue to try to educate and mobilize. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the church and the pastor as far as that's concerned?
The role of the church in the digital age is going to look different. And I think that's kind of the challenge we speak about with the church. We have intergenerational church. We have the remnant of the silent age. We have the boomers. And then we have everybody else, Gen X, Y, Z, Alpha, all in generally, it's essentially one place. I mean, I have in my congregation, I have a family that is 5 generations alive in my congregation. So like what we're watching is the tension between the generational shift, right? So when we think of civic engagement, as Reverend Bailey said, It's more than just the vote, right? Like I suggest that at times we treat voting as helicopter parents. We swoop in to make things right and then swoop back out and then come back when things go wrong again. Like civic engagement is not just being a helicopter parent swooping in November to go do your vote. It's year long. I always tell people, really, it all begins the day after the election. That's when everything begins. That's when you hold your officials accountable and everything else. But in the digital age, civic engagement is going to look different. The first step is that the church has to understand the digital age. And it's not just social media. We also got to understand the use of AI in that conversation. That is going to be the cutting edge piece of the conversation that we're not even having at this point of this, and the issues of the idea of the AI generated images that presents and what we call ultimately the post-truth society. That's the best way to summarize it. You may call it fake news, but it's generally termed as the post-truth society. So a digital age and post-truth society with AI is an ethical nightmare for the church. How do you begin to engage those conversations? You have to understand that the ability to access people is easier and harder at the same time. Though you may have the social media platforms, the algorithm is designed to, you're not the user, you are the product. We have to remember the position we sit in social media platforms. We are the people for whom the marketing agencies want to get us to buy the lotion bottle I just looked on Amazon for that now pops up on all my social media feeds, and I was not trying to see that. Like, we have to put that in perspective inside of it, and it's not just put it on Facebook and everybody will see it. That's not the way Facebook works. You got to boost the ad and put money into the system for the system to work. You have to put oil in the machine. We have to understand that the civic engagement has the capacity to do good, and we've seen this for literally almost 2 decades now in this capacity. But we have to engage in a different way, and we have to also reframe how we understand engaging with people beyond the church. We haven't had time to talk that conversation just yet, but let us not romanticize the Black church in this conversation. In the 1960s, as we talk about this great period, King was kicked out of my denomination because he was just too much of a rabble-rouser. That's where you get the PNBC is formed with Gardner C. Taylor, Dr. King, as a result of the idea of this. So you still have people who believe, why are you upsetting the apple cart inside of our congregations? On top of, what do you mean we're going to do this on Facebook? So all those coming together is the intergenerational challenges we're facing, but we do have great opportunities to reach the masses. We've seen it as we have gone virtual, my congregation, other congregations, that you're now able to access a worldwide audience. But we have to understand that that worldwide audience is great and everybody's good, but at the end of the day, we still need people to show up for whatever needs to be showed up for. You can get 100,000 likes and only get 24 votes. You still got to vote. There is still an in-person, or we used to call it IRL, in real life, account that's required for civic engagement. Even if it's at the school board meetings, if it's at the town hall, if it's at the board of supervisors, if it's in the General Assembly, if it's at Congress, or write a letter to the President of the United States of America. It is still an in-person requirement. I think we have to understand how that is shifting and shifts in this new age, both digital and in post-truth.
You said so much, Dr. Blizzard. I would love to just like hang out there for just a while and talk about just the challenge of the getting people to understand that that in-person piece is still so valuable and necessary and needed, as we are definitely in this digital space. And coming out of 2020, people got really comfortable being at home. And so, it's just the challenges that we now face, so that people understand that presence and physical presence absolutely plays a pivotal place, particularly in civic engagement. Okay, so as we wrap this up, Reverend Smith Bond, as we're thinking about, we're already touching the conversation about possible future strategies that the Black church can utilize as we're looking at, again, galvanizing the civic engagement within our communities and our congregations. What are some lasting words of encouragement or suggestions or strategies that you want to offer into the space for those who are listening?
Absolutely. So one, I would say partnerships. We have to understand that there's power in numbers. And when we're talking about the Black church and how do we adapt these strategies, we have to understand that collaboration in this day and time is what's going to really allow us to thrive, right? So collaborating with grassroots organizations and local businesses to expand the voter education initiatives, right? Even what we're doing today, getting on here, having this conversation to provide resources, right? Also the partnerships in regards to partner to make sure that we're eliminating the barriers, connecting with other places in regards to making sure that we're able to provide transportation to the polling locations and other things. So partnerships is essential. Also, when we talk about early voting advocacy, we have to understand that this is not a conversation that we can start like a couple of months before the election. As the Black church, we should be talking about voting. We should be talking about using our voice every single month. Like this needs to be incorporated in our vision and mission in regards to how every single month, right, of the year, we're constantly talking about it so that it doesn't become like a wave thing that we do. Like an election comes up, let's start talking about it, but people can really start to buy into this notion that it's a part of who we are, right? And in order for you to do that, it has to be at the forefront. So I would say even with the early voting advocacy, for us to expand and really be able to like use those different resources throughout the month, throughout the year, and bring it in the forefront of our congregants and the spaces that we're called to serve. The last thing is I think that there's a great opportunity of youth engagement. I know that we talk about the youth that don't want to vote and the youth that may not be able to vote because they're not 18. However, if we develop programming and initiatives that target engaging youth voters and ensuring that they understand the importance of early voting and the civic participation, even if it means that we're training individuals that are not 18 years old about grassroots operations, about how do you, make phone calls, how do you write letters, how do you do X, Y, and Z, right? I think that that is a huge thing that the church can maximize because what we have to also understand is that the energy and the buy-in of our youth is really going to bring in everyone else, right? So if you get the youth excited, energized, and they're going home talking about it to their parents and going home in their spaces and talking about it, then we have like a greater expansion in regards to our voice. So those would be like the three things. And of course, what Dr. Let's just say in regards to the digital outreach. Listen, COVID taught us one thing is that, we gonna get the word out regardless. We may not can gather, but we were so creative as an African American community church, right, to make sure that we did not stop in regards to making sure that we're able to still get the word out, the hope, that people still had space to be empowered, all of that stuff, right? So I think in regards to doing that is let us not shy away from the digital outreach, right? Even if it's just a simple post of a countdown, even if it's a simple post of equipping them with knowledge of, what's going to be on the ballot, what it looks like, do fact checks, let's do this, right? Social media, this digital thing is not going away. So either we're going to find a way to use it for our benefit or it's going to really go past us. But I think it's a great opportunity for us to maximize when we're looking at like those future strategies.
Thank you so much, Reverend Smith-Bond. Okay, words of encouragement, challenge that you want to offer to those who are listening?
Did you call my name, Dr. Cook? You
I
froze just a
did.
minute. Okay, great.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Look, I first of all, thank you for this forum. I love this forum, and I hope that those who are actually hearing us now and those who will hear us, on listening to the recording, get the sense that when we come together, when we do all the things that we've talked about here, we actually do make a difference. Again, looking back in history, in 1960, only 40% of the eligible Black voters, those who were registered, turned out to vote. By 1984, that had gone up to 60%. That seems like a small jump, over that 24-year period. But the reason that it did go up, combined with, the choice of candidates that we had, was because of voter registration, education, and mobilization efforts like we've talked about tonight. And then in 2012, we jumped to 66.6%, 2/3 exactly mathematically of all of the eligible Black voters actually turned out to vote. Now, why did it happen? And it wasn't just because that was Barack Obama's reelection year. It was because of the efforts of organizations like the NAACP, like the VICPP, like the Alphas, Omegas, AKAs, and Deltas, and all other organizations being focused on registration, education, and mobilization. And we began also to take advantage of those early voting opportunities. One other small fact, 66% of the eligible Black voters in 2012 was greater than the percentage of eligible white voters. When we work, we can make things happen. We have always been, since Reconstruction, the most important, impactful part of the electorate of this country. They tried to keep us from being a part of it. We have to fight even harder to maintain where we are. So again, thank you, Dr. Cook. Thank you, Reverend Smithboy. Thank you, Dr. Blizzard, and thank you, Brother Lester, for this opportunity to speak this evening.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Bailey. All right, Reverend Blizzard, bring us on home. What's that final thought, that final challenge, that final word of encouragement?
I'd like to thank VICPP for allowing us to be in this space tonight, Dr. Cook, Lester, grateful to be here with Reverend Smith Bond and be in your presence to share. What I'd like to leave everybody tonight is one simple statement. Don't get lost in the hype of charisma. You have to think about this as the issues. No matter how somebody sounds or whatever, you have to understand the issues. I remember the 2004 election, presidential election, George Bush beat John Kerry. And the takeaway for that was Bush was more of a better drinking buddy than John Kerry was. We have to move past the personalities. We have to move past that and see and hear the truth of what people are actually expressing, talking about. But we can't just do this when it comes 15 days before the election. We have to do this, as Reverend Smith Bond says, I also said, the day after the election. It's a year-long process of mobilizing bodies to get out and vote. People have to understand what the issues are. And even as our own churches and nonprofits, you can talk about the issues straight from the pulpit every single Sunday and never cross the line of the Johnson Amendment. To take with you, if you haven't seen it, nothing what that is. You have to talk about the issues. You have to get the issue to understand what is impacting you on a day-to-day basis. What is happening and how does it look? And you can hear this, the talk and the conversations. I'm in a space where conservative voices drown out liberal voices because they don't want to upset their friends, so they just go on with it. You have to understand what affects your family and your future. And with that, you have to exercise your voice to vote. I encourage everybody to make sure you know what is happening with who is running. Don't just stop at the top of the ticket. My goodness, please know who else is on that ballot, because you're going to be shocked when there's a lot of people and a referendum on the back. You have to know who's running at the federal, state, and local elections, because the people who impact you the most is usually going to be that county person who is going to determine how your child learns, how your roads are done, who gets what inside of your space, and those referendums on the back. Know the issues. You don't have to be an expert on the issues and understand the fiscal entanglements for the next 15 years and how it affects cash flow. You don't have to know that, but you have to know how it's going to affect you. And if you don't know, that's where these organizations come. That's going to help you learn better, like VICPP and NAACP. Glad to be here tonight.
Thank you so much for that. Now, Brother Lester doesn't know I'm going to call his name, but just Robert, if you could just do a quick announcement, because we do have a Souls to the Poll event that's coming up on this coming Sunday that we've been working really hard on here in Richmond, the one Sunday that Richmond has to vote during the early voting process. So Robert, give us a really quick high level what we got going on.
Okay, thank you for just these brief moments. Well, yes, this coming Sunday is the only day in Richmond, Virginia that the polls will be open, and we are excited about the opportunity for folks to have just what we talked about earlier, the opportunity to be able to vote on this Sunday, especially when we talked about the barriers, you know, time, work, children, and things of that nature. So we are excited about the fact that we're going to mobilize on Sunday. We have working with Virginia Interfaith Center, we work with all denominations. So we have our Muslim brothers and sisters are coming out to the polls. We have our AMEs, we have our Baptists, we have our coaches, we have everyone. And along with our other coalition partners, the NAACP is supporting us in Richmond, Crusade for Voters, SCLC. We have so many people that are mobilized. And as Reverend Smith Bond said, we're not forgetting about our people in the public housing. We are mobilizing. We are spreading the word inside of the public housing, and we're working on getting rides for the folks to come over. So we're fully engaged in that area too, and we're also reaching out to senior living facilities. So we are looking for a big day. Right now, the voting in Richmond is very low for early voting. As of the 20th this month, it showed that only 17,000 people have voted. And at the same time in 2020, 36,000 people had voted. So the numbers are way down, and we want to avoid that long line on Tuesday, November the 5th. So it's very important. If anybody hears my voice now, please come out and vote on Sunday. We're going to make it a festive event. We have music, we're going to have food. It's just going to be a great time for us to come together collectively, all different organizations, all different faiths, and just do our civic duty and cast our ballots. Thank you, Dr. Cook.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Robert. And so I want to thank again our wonderful panelists. Thank you for your time and giving all your wisdom in this space. So Reverend Bailey, Reverend Blizzard, Reverend Smith Bond, we appreciate all that you're doing in your communities and in the Commonwealth as a whole. So thank those of you who have joined us live, and for those who are watching this recording back, let's all do our part. Let's galvanize all of our family and friends so we can get out and early vote, and we can truly make a difference, because we know our vote is our voice. So thank you again for joining us. Good night.